Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 2, Chapter 4 of George Orwell's classic, 1984. Let's see what happens next, shall we? Can this whole love affair continue under the eyes of Big Brother? Are they actually watching? I don't know, but let's see. This chapter starts out with Winston sitting at the top of Mr. Charrington's shop. The shop where he had bought the diary, the pen, and the paperweight. Winston lights one of the burners on the small stove and sets a pan of water to boil. He had brought an envelope full of Victory coffee and some saccharin tablets. The clock hand in the room said 7:20, and it was really 1920. Winston says that Julia was supposed to arrive at 1930. Winston says that he knows it's stupid, he knows it's suicidal, and that all of the crimes the party members could commit, this one was the least possible to conceal. Winston goes on to tell the reader that he was renting this room from Mr. Charrington so him and Julia could have a private space and be together. He said the privacy was very valuable and that everyone wanted a place where they could be alone occasionally. And he knew that this place did not have a telescreen or a microphone. Mr. Charrington did not even put up the slightest bit of a fight because he knew the money would be worth it. As Winston is thinking about all of this, from the window he can hear someone singing, and he looks out and sees a woman who's washing diapers and singing to herself. Winston notes the song that she's singing was created by the party for the proles. He also mentions how though the song was terrible, this woman had a fantastic voice and could make it almost listenable. Winston goes back to his train of thought and tells the reader that originally Julie and him were supposed to meet at the clearing in the countryside, but when they met 2 days previous, she said the whole thing was off. She says that the reason for this was the usual reason, and that it started early this time. At first, Winston's not happy about this because the more he thinks about her, the more he realizes that the relationship is not just purely physical, but that there's some sensuality to it. He knows that the first time that they made love, it was just essentially the act itself. But the closer they've gotten over time, over the past month to month and a half, he realizes that he loves her. He loves her hair, the smell of it. He loves the feeling of the taste of her in his mouth, and that he seems to be obsessing over all the little different aspects of her. He also says that he thinks that when she doesn't want to meet up, it's because she's cheating on him. But the slightest little movement of hands or touch or feeling from her quickly takes that notion out of his head. He also muses about how he wishes they could be a couple and be married, how they could walk down the street holding hands together and buying frivolous things for their household. Winston tells the reader that when he asks Julia if she would be interested in meeting him at Mr. Charrington's place, she quickly agrees without any further thought. As Winston is thinking all of this, he suddenly hears Julia on the stairs and she bursts into the room. When she comes into the room, she has a small bag that she's carrying. Winston makes his way to her, but she quickly tells him, no, hold on. And she gets on her knees and opens the sack. She wants to show him what she brought. She asks him if he brought Victory coffee, and he says yes. She tells him that, well, he can throw that away because they won't need it. As she's beginning to unwrap the bag, Winston realizes that she's pulling different things out of it, and he begins to question her. She pulls out real sugar, a loaf of bread, a pot of jam, and also a small tin of milk and real coffee. As she pulls all the coffee out and begins to unwrap it, Winston can smell it permeating around the room. Winston says it's real coffee, and she says it's inner party coffee, and that she has a whole kilo of it right here. He asks, how did you manage to get a hold of all of these things? And she says it's all the party stuff, and that there's nothing those swines don't have. She said, of course, waiters and servants and people pinched things, and that's how she was able to get a small pocket of tea as well. She reassures him that it is actual tea because she learned that the party has somehow gotten a hold of India. She also says that it's real. It's not just blackberry leaves. She then tells him to go sit on the bed and wait with his back turned to her for about 3 minutes and don't look, and wait for her signal. As Winston is sitting on the bed looking out through the window, he can see the woman below singing again, and now she's finishing up. He mentions that her voice floated upwards with the sweet summer air very tunefully and changed with a sort of happy melancholy. He says that he has a feeling that she would be perfectly content if that June evening had been endless and the supply of clothes inexhaustible. He then realizes that he never has heard a party member sing alone spontaneously. He also said perhaps it's only when people were somewhat near the starvation level they had anything to sing about. Julia then says that Winston can turn around. As Winston turns around, he thinks that she's going to be standing in front of him naked, but in fact, she was still clothed, and as he looked at her, he realized she had put makeup on her face. He says it wasn't expertly done by any means, but the small amount of color that was added to her face only helped to intensify her beauty. As he also moves closer to her, he can smell the perfume of the violets coming from her. Winston tells the reader that this was actually the exact same scent used by the prostitute that he had slept with years prior. But at this point, it didn't matter because now he associated the scent with Julia. She asks if he likes it, and he says that he does. She says that she's going to try and find a frock and some stockings and some high heels, and that in this room she's going to dress like a proper lady, not like a member of the party. They then both take off their clothes and they go to bed and make love. After that, they both fall asleep, and not too long after, Winston wakes up before Julia. As he's lying there, she has her head rested in the crook of his arm, and he can hear the sounds of the streets coming up from the windows. The woman has stopped singing from below, but he can now hear children playing out on the streets. Winston thinks to himself how this is such a wonderful moment, and that surely this couldn't have possibly been real, or it couldn't have existed prior to the party. He also mentions that as he's waking up, the last little bit of sunlight is coming through the room, and you can see that all of her makeup had been smudged and probably transferred to his face as well. He then says that she wakes up and she notices that half the water has been boiled away, to which she says, "Oh, don't worry," and she'll go put some more on and make coffee in just a moment. She said they've got an hour, and then she asks, "What time do they cut the lights off at your flat?" And he answers at 23:30. And she says, "Oh, for me it's 23 at the hostel." And so she has to get back soon. Before she's able to respond, she quickly screams out, "You filthy brood," and she throws something across the room. Winston asked, "What is it?" And she said that she saw a rat coming from the wainscoting of the room, from a small little hole. Winston can't believe it and says, "Rats? In this room?" Julia says, "Oh yes, rats are all over the place, and that they have them in the kitchen at the hostel where she lives." She also says that London is swarming with rats, and she asks Winston, "Do you know that they attack children?" She also said that a lot of the mothers won't leave their small children unattended in the streets for fear of rats eating them. At the sound of this, Winston has his eyes closed and is starting to turn pale. The reader learns that Winston is deathly afraid of rats, and that he has this reoccurring nightmare about a solid black wall and something horrible on the other side of it. Winston says that he's never been able to finish the dream, but that he knows the rats have to be on the other side of that wall. She says not to worry, and next time that they're there in the room, she's going to plug up the hole so that way the rats can't get in. And then a little while after that, she'll bring in some plaster to properly plug up the holes. After this, Winston settles down and Julia goes over to the stove and begins making the coffee. As the coffee is being made, Winston notes how wonderful it smells, and they also decide to shut the window in case anybody else could smell it for fear of inquisitive minds. Winston tells the reader that he forgets how great coffee tastes and how wonderful the texture was, including the real sugar, which he almost forgotten the taste of. As they're both enjoying the coffee, Julia's walking around the room, sitting in chairs and looking over everything with an inquisitive mind. She reaches for the paperweight that Winston had bought weeks earlier, and she asks, "What is this? And what use is it?" Winston says that he doesn't think it actually had a use, but that it was simply a message from the past if people were able to decode it. She then goes over to the picture and she asks, "What is this place in the picture?" To which Winston says, "Oh, it's a church, or at least it used to be, that it was St. Clement's." And at that moment, part of the rhyme that Mr. Carrington had said had came back to his mind, that oranges and lemons says the bells of St. Clement. To his astonishment, Julia added the line, "You owe me 3 farthings, says the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, says the bells of Old Bailey." She says that she can't remember how it goes on after that, but she remembers how it ends. "Here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." Winston was mesmerized. He could not believe by the fact that she knew part of this rhyme. Julia says, "Oh, her grandfather used to tell it to her before he was vaporized, and that was when she was about 8. She says that she always wondered what a lemon was. Julia mentioned that she's seen oranges, and they were kind of a yellowish round fruit with a thick skin. Winston says that he could remember lemons and that they were quite common in the 50s. Also, they were sour, and that it set your teeth on edge every time to smell them. Julia then says she bets the picture has bugs behind it, and not to worry, she'll take it down and give it a good cleaning someday. She then says she supposes it's time that they should be leaving, and she must be washing the paint off of her face, and that she'll also make sure to get the lipstick off of his. As Julia is doing all of this, Winston is sitting down for a few minutes and is staring at the paperweight. As he's looking at this paperweight, he seems to be in thought about how this room is very much like the paperweight itself, and how him and Julia are the coral inside of it at the heart of the crystal. This is where part 2, chapter 4 ends. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.